I wanna I wanna start with a little bit of my own personal story. I came to meditation at 17, and I was completely convinced from the very beginning that the Buddhist path would relieve my suffering. And my experience was that the insights that I had from retreats and from meditation showed me that that was actually possible. And yet, the insights that I had would pass. And so at 27 years old, I entered a monastery and I lived as a Buddhist nun for 26 years as a fully ordained and 28 years, including the time as the postulate. And one of the things that's really a blessing about living in a monastery is that it's a hyper saturated Dharma environment for practice. We had winter retreats that were 3 months long and summer retreats that were a month long, and we had 10-day retreats a few times a year, and we had 3 hours of meditation a day and meditation vigils every full and new moon, Dharma talks weekly, and when we were having retreats daily. I mean, it was this hyper saturated Dharma environment. And yet what I understood from my time living in the monastery is that my access to the insights that I had from the meditation was hard. It wasn't easy. And so I looked for frames of reference that would help me understand why, what was going on? Why here I am in this environment that's completely set up to support meditation. And my own personal experience was that while I did have genuine insight, I couldn't stabilize it. I couldn't just rest there. I think it's been about 15 years ago that I started studying attachment theory. And it was fascinating for me to learn as I opened up attachment theory that attachment disturbances are very resilient. Something like 85% chance that the pattern that our primary caregiver had is the same one that we have. It's like 70% chance that the pattern our great grandmother had is the same one that we have. So when I heard this kind of statistics, it became clear that attachment patterns are not easy to shift. And so this began to kind of be like one of the missing links, that may be part of the reason why it is hard for us to fulfill the promise of meditation is because our attachment formations are not shifting with the meditation that we're doing. So in the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha says that if you practice the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and then he goes on, 7 years, 6 years, 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, 1, let alone 1 year, 7 months, 6 months, he does this whole thing. And then he comes down. If you practice the foundations of mindfulness for 7 days, 7 days, you can expect one of 2 things. One is that you are completely free from all traces of suffering, or there's a tiny little smidgy bit left. So I have been practicing for more than 7 days, and I have more than a tiny little bit of smidgy bit left. Why? What's going on? So when I begin to understand the interplay of trauma, and particularly attachment wounding and attachment trauma, then it helps me contextualize why our capacity to fulfill the promise of meditation and eliminate sorrow, pain, and distress may be limited. It's not anybody's fault. The parents did as best as they could with the attachment patterns they had. It isn't our fault. It's not that we didn't try hard enough or meditate long enough or spend more years trying. It's not that we're not good meditators. So blame isn't helpful. What is an interesting question is to ask, all right, if it's possible that our attachment formation is impacting our ability to meditate and realize the fruits of meditation, what can I do about it? And what can I do about it now? So I want to talk about components of attachment disturbance and some of the consequences that are relevant for us as meditators, and speak about an approach that can be used for repair. Before I get too far into this, I just want to step back a bit and look at the word attachment. In the Buddhist language, attachment refers to the unhealthy grasping of desire, anger, or views. This is considered the source root of all forms of suffering. So when we are thinking about the Buddhist attachment, we want to get rid of it. It's not the thing that helps, it's the thing that causes our distress. It's the thing that causes the suffering that we experience, and it's causing the suffering in the world. Psychological attachment is the bonding that forms between a caregiver and a child. And when a child has 5 things, particularly during formative years, from birth to 2 years of age, those 5 things are safety, attunement, emotional soothing, delight in their essence, encouragement to explore and develop. These 5 wholesome qualities are very indicative to the child feeling secure, seen and known, soothed and comforted, valued in their essence, and confident exploring the world and expressing who they uniquely are. So when caregivers show up, children learn to co-regulate with them. Children learn that caregivers will support them making sense out of the world. They learn what relaxation and safety feel like. When children are seen and valued and encouraged to be and express themselves as who they uniquely are, they feel good about themselves and expect that the people around them will treat them in a similar way. We gravitate towards what's familiar. And so it's often the case that our relationships as adults mirror our relationships with our caregivers as children. And when we had relationships with our caregivers that are based in trust, where we feel seen, safe, and confident, then we have many less obstacles in meditation. But conversely, if we didn't have good enough care, it means that our basic needs were not met reliably. And we're not talking about 100%, we're talking about a fraction. But not good enough also means that ruptures were not acknowledged or repaired. Sometimes caregivers caused harm. So when a child is reliant upon someone unreliable, or often dismisses their feelings, rejects or abandons them, when a caregiver uses a child to manage their feelings as an adult, when a child's safety is dependent upon somebody who harms them, the child compensates. And the compensation leads to different insecure attachment strategies. And they have names: anxious avoidant, anxious ambivalent, disorganized. And these are for the child. As an adult, they have slightly different names: dismissive, anxious, and disorganized. But these 3 insecure attachment strategies are all signs of attachment disturbances. So What's helpful is to keep these things in context, particularly if we start opening up this whole topic and begin to start noticing our own attachment strategies. The attachment strategies that we have are help us make sense out of what is going on, and they help keep us safe. This is really important to help us understand how adaptive our survival mechanisms are. It's not a sign of our brokenness. It's a sign of our ways of coping with something that was incredibly challenging. And the reason why this is important is for a few reasons. I have a kitty who's outside crying, and when she cries, she's telling me it's an emergency. So there's often kitty emergencies. She needs emergency cuddles. When we learn how our behaviors, relationships, and core beliefs have so much to do with our attachment patterns and how resistant they are to changing, it can help us understand why the Buddhist promises practices lead to liberation, and yet many of us are suffering after quite a lot of in-depth meditation practice. In another way, which is also significant, as meditators, it's important that we perceive what is going on in the present moment. And when we have attachment disturbances, there are three distinct ways that our attachment disturbance changes what we are able to know. According to the work by Stephen Terrell and Kathy Kane, example of these changes are becoming extra alert to signals of danger and missing neutral or positive feelings, living in a faux window of tolerance, looking like we're calm but actually we're anxious, and interception is impacted. We cannot feel and interpret correctly what is going on. When we're extra alert, it means our system is hyper-aroused. We aren't able to notice neutral and positive feelings that help us feel calmer. And so when we actually are calm, rather than when we appear calm, is important in how we manage our internal state. When we cannot feel or interpret correctly what's going on, both of which are essential components of meditation, we've reduced our capacity to make meditation tools effective. When we're living in a faux window of tolerance, it means that we do not use methods to calm ourselves because we don't think we need them. And sometimes our therapists and our meditation teachers may not notice either. When we routinely miss neutral or positive feelings and live in a faux window of tolerance, stress compounds. Stress increases cortisol levels. It impacts our blood pressure and heart rate. Breathing becomes rapid and shallow. That causes inflammation, pain, and a whole myriad of health issues. Our physiology impacts our mind states. The more stress we experience, the more we are primed to look for and see danger, catastrophize, feel anxious, angry, out of control, and overwhelmed. And all of this contributes to feeling unsafe. Our physiology then drives what we see and do in our relationships and how we feel about what is going on in the world. When we understand the far-ranging impacts of attachment disturbances on our health, on our relationships, on our core beliefs, on the way we view ourselves, on the way we view the world, and our ability to manage the various kinds of traumas we have, then it can motivate us to find ways to repair the disturbance and return to healthy patterns. So I want to shift gears and talk about three pillars approach that I was introduced to. This approach was founded by the late Dr. Daniel P. Brown and David Elliott. David is still living. It consists of collaborative co-regulation, enhanced metacognition, or the ability to use the mind to analyze the mind, and restructuring the internal working model of attachment using imagined ideal parent figures. So when we look at it from a kind of stepping back, I had a long conversation with David not that long ago, and he was saying, they didn't create the three pillars. They created the ideal parent figure, but using collaborative co-regulation and metacognition as a kind of foundation to bring forward something that helps support change you can find it all over the place. The first pillar uses relational mindfulness. And we have heard the Buddha say from the very beginning that wise friends is the whole of the holy life. It's not the half of it. I was teaching a class on a trauma-informed satipatthana, and I brought up Bhikkhu Bodhi's table on the hindrances and lists all the 5 hindrances and what supports them arising and what supports them reducing. And the only one single thing that was the same on all of the 5 hindrances is conversation with wise friends, is the universal antidote for all of the hindrances. And I brought up the table for the factors of awakening. And the one universal factor that supports all of the other factors of awakening is a close association with wise friends. So collaboration and being with wise people has been something that has been spoken about for a long time. Enhanced metacognition, or using the mind to analyze the mind, is really what the essence of the 4 foundations of mindfulness of Vipassana practice is. That's a psychotherapeutic language to talk about exactly what we're doing with the 3rd and the 4th foundation of mindfulness. And the 3rd pillar takes components of Tibetan Buddhist practice where you use something that you visualize, which is ideal, perfect, in order to rub against the parts of yourself and your mind and your psyche that are not yet realized in its perfection. So collaborative co-regulation is what happens when somebody is present with you, sees you, understands you, supports you, to know what's going on for yourself and find more ease. Co-regulators can be relaxed, present, grounded, and bring forward non-judgmental awareness. They can also be protective. Their interest is on you and what is happening for you, what supports you. They can be your teacher, your spiritual friends, they can be a therapist. I have been co-regulating with pets and trees and rocks and the ocean for decades. So as we develop a repertoire of co-regulators, we can soothe ourselves more easily. The second pillar, mentalization or metacognition, is, as I said, the psychological languaging for insight meditation, learning how to notice what's happening, differentiate between our perceived experience and what is actually happening, recognize the beliefs that are underpinning our experience. And this is where our insight practice comes into the picture. If we're upset and feel sad, and then we shift from the thoughts and the feelings to the body sensations that underpin the sad feeling, sometimes it makes it easier to stay present without getting caught in the whirlwind of associations about why we're sad. When we're caught in the whirlwind, it can lead to further states of powerlessness or feelings of despair. The sadness is what's actually happening. The despair or feelings of powerlessness come from the way that we are relating to the sadness. The beliefs we have about the despair may influence how we relate to it. And yet when we shift gears and focus maybe to the unpleasant quality of it, or to the place where we're locating it in our body, and just stay with the physical experience as we know sadness, or we know despair, or we know powerlessness as a direct body experience, then we have more capacity to be with it without getting caught by the whirlwinds that might be associated with it. And then in that capacity, we can come forward with something that is compassionate or wise. When we're caught, it undermines our ability to respond in a wise and loving way. So one of the things that happens with all of this in our attachment formation is that our capacity to mentalize is orders of magnitude faster and more accurate for somebody who's securely attached than for somebody who has an attachment disturbance. It's a log scale, not a linear scale. 10 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times faster. As mentalization increases in accuracy, an individual is able to know what they are feeling and sensing and make sense out of what happens internally. That leads to more capacity to soothe themselves. The more one is able to mentalize, the more an individual will be able to use meditation tools effectively. And our mentalization capacity is directly connected to our ability to know and communicate what's going on, to observe what we notice in someone else, to resolve differences of perception, and repair ruptures. So this is significant in all healthy relationships. So the three-pillar approach that Dan Brown and David Elliott created brings together collaborative co-regulation, mentalization, and the ideal parent figures. And the ideal parent figures is really where the mind is offering an imagined ideal parent who is completely able to bring forward the safety, protection, attunement, soothing, delight, encouragement that we may not have received when we were little. And what happens, which is quite mind-blowing, is that our minds are fascinating in that it doesn't matter if it's imagined or if it's real, as long as we have the direct experience of safety, of attunement, of soothing, of delight, of encouragement. That is what is important, that those experiences are vivid, alive, real in terms of how we are experiencing them. It doesn't matter that we imagine somebody that helps us get there. What is significant is having those direct experiences of those 5 basic qualities. And the more that we have those basic experiences, the more our nervous system starts rearranging itself based on the presence of them rather than the absence of them. And that's how our internal working model starts to shift. So, having lived through everything that I've lived through, having lived in the monastery for decades, and I can tell you with quite a lot of confidence that a monastery is actually not a picnic. There's all kinds of things that go on in a monastery that are rather unsavory, and you would be surprised. But what I've learned is that when you have a community that doesn't deliberately focus on trauma repair and doesn't have any mechanism for attachment repair, and it just presumes that meditation is going to be all that everybody needs, guess what? Guess what? Trauma that is not repaired tends to repeat itself. Attachment wounding that is not repaired tends to perpetuate more trauma. That's just what happens. It's kind of natural. In a monastery, out of a monastery, it just is natural. So I have wanted to do something that puts these things together. So with Dr. Elliott's endorsement, I have taken this three-pillar approach, which they created as a psychotherapeutic tool, and designed it as a Sangha activity for meditators, making it more accessible and widening the collaborative co-regulation from it being just a therapist to being a meditation teacher, and for people to learn how to do this together with each other as peers. So the first cohort started in January, and we're halfway through. And they are experiencing some positive results from the practice. It's too early to tell what the whole thing will be like, in terms of whether there's going to be statistically significant results from it all. But they are seeing improvements in their ability to track and their ability to stay attuned to themselves and to each other. And now, from now on, I'm going to be introducing the ideal parent figure with them, working with them one-on-one, and helping them to be witness for each other as they do that guided imagery themselves. And we are all curious to see what happens, So statistically, a majority of children worldwide have good enough caregivers and are securely attached. And if as a child you grew up and you were not securely attached, then there are things that you can do to support yourself. Attachment wounding is not innate. It's resilient, but it is not innate. One of the things that happens and that I'm noticing in this cohort is that it makes it more possible to notice when you feel unsafe and then to soothe yourself. And as you experience more safety throughout the day, your stress levels decrease. As your stress levels decrease, your hypervigilance starts to decrease. And as all of these things start to combine, then it starts clearing the obstacles to awakening. We stop living in a faux window of tolerance when we actually know the difference between when we feel safe and we don't feel safe. Our ability to stay present and focused deepens. As we remove the obstacles to interoception, we more accurately perceive what's going on. Clear seeing supports clear understanding. This supports our insight practice. And seeing into the characteristics of reality is a direct pathway to liberation. So one of the things that has been also of a lot of interest to me is that when we have attachment wounding and it remains unhealed or unrepaired, then what can happen in meditation is that experiences of emptiness, where there's not a solid sense of self, or any of the non-dual expressions of that, can trigger terror. Now, we know from meditation practice that experiencing fear is a classic sign, symptom, stage as we are approaching the stages of emptiness or the experiences of emptiness. But when that fear mimics the abandonment terror that can be present when unmet basic needs were severe during formative years, the fear, which is a natural and inevitable response, becomes a trauma response. And almost always, when we are in a trauma response, we have to back away from the trigger in order to heal. And if we do not see the linking between the trauma response, the abandonment terror, and our attachment wounding, then what happens is there can be this fear or resistance of meditation, which then makes the experience of emptiness much, much less accessible. Conversely, when we have gone through the efforts to repair our attachment wounding, emptiness doesn't trigger a trauma activation and can be a support for deepening insight into the fundamental reality of phenomena. There isn't something that is inherently there. That is correct. But we can't see that. We can't get there. We can't touch it. We can't get anywhere close when we are experiencing the terror of not having our basic needs met and feeling abandoned. So in these ways, attachment repair is significant in our support for our meditation practice, in our ability to deepen our capacity to stay present and our insight into realizing the fruits of awakening. Since meditation by itself rarely shifts our attachment pattern, and since our attachment pattern has a very significant impact on our ability to use meditation for ourselves and to realize the freedom that the Buddha said was innate, then the invitation is there to explore if repairing attachment wounding is worthy of your attention and effort.